The boy stood in the rain, his thin hands shaking as he knocked on the massive iron door of the billionaire's mansion. When the door finally opened, he didn't beg for money. He didn't ask for food. With tear-filled eyes, he whispered, "You're the only one my mom trusts, and she's dying." The man froze, because the boy's face looked exactly like someone he had lost 25 years ago, and the truth the child was about to reveal would tear open a past he had buried with his own heart. If stories about love, sacrifice, and second chances move you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this journey. The story began on a cold evening in Chicago, where the rain fell softly over two completely different worlds. On the north side of the city stood the estate of Daniel Whitmore, a billionaire CEO known for his discipline, his success, and his distance from the world. At 62, Daniel lived alone in a house too large for one man. His wife had passed away years earlier. His only daughter had died long before that. Or at least, that's what he believed. Daniel's life ran like a clock. Dinner at 7. Work calls until 9. A quiet walk through his empty halls afterward. No laughter. No noise. Just memories he tried not to visit. That evening, he was reviewing financial reports in his study when the head of security knocked urgently. "Sir, there's a child at the main gate. He says he won't leave until he sees you." Daniel frowned. "A child?" "Yes, sir. About 10 years old. He's soaked. Says it's important." Daniel almost told them to send the boy away. But something about the words, "he won't leave," stirred an old memory inside him. "Bring him in," Daniel said quietly. 5 minutes later, the boy stood in the grand entry hall, dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. He was thin. His clothes were worn and slightly too small. His sneakers were torn at the edges. But his eyes were steady, determined. Daniel walked down the staircase slowly, studying him. "What's your name, son?" he asked. "Ethan," the boy replied. "Ethan Parker." "And why are you here, Ethan?" The boy swallowed, gripping a small folded envelope in his hand. "My mom told me to come here if something bad happened. She said, if she ever couldn't take care of me anymore, I should find you." Daniel's expression tightened. "I don't know your mother," he said carefully. Ethan stepped forward and held out the envelope. "She said you would recognize her handwriting." Daniel hesitated before taking it. His hands, steady in billion-dollar negotiations, trembled slightly as he opened the letter. The moment he saw the first line, his breath stopped. "Daniel, if you are reading this, it means I waited too long to tell you the truth." The letter was signed with a name he hadn't spoken in 25 years. Sarah. The room seemed to tilt. Sarah had been his first love. The woman he was supposed to marry before life, ambition, and a terrible misunderstanding tore them apart. He had spent years believing she left him for someone else. And now, a boy was standing in his house with her name in his hands. Daniel looked at Ethan again, this time more closely. The boy had Sarah's eyes. But the shape of his jaw. It looked painfully familiar. "Where is your mother now?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter than before. "In the hospital," Ethan said. "She didn't want to go at first. We don't have insurance. But she collapsed this morning." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. "When did she tell you to come to me?" "Years ago," Ethan replied. "She said if anything ever happened, you'd help. She said you were the only person she ever trusted with my future." Daniel walked slowly to a chair and sat down, still holding the letter. "Does she know you came here?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. "She was asleep when I left. I took the bus. Then I walked." Security exchanged uneasy glances behind them. The estate sat far from the nearest bus line. The boy must have walked miles in the rain. Daniel unfolded the rest of the letter. Sarah's words were filled with apologies, regret, and something else. A secret. I never told you the truth the day I left, the letter read. I thought I was protecting you. But I was wrong. Daniel's heart pounded. He looked up at Ethan again. How old are you? 10. Daniel did the math without meaning to. 10 years. 10 years ago was when Sarah had disappeared completely from any records he could find. He leaned forward slowly. Ethan, who is your father? The boy hesitated. My mom said, I should only tell you after you read the whole letter. Daniel swallowed. The house felt too quiet, too heavy. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Inside, a lifetime of buried memories was beginning to surface. Ethan shifted nervously, his small hands clenched together. Sir, can you help her? He asked quietly. They said at the hospital, if we don't pay soon, they might move her somewhere else. She's really sick. That question broke something inside Daniel. 4 years, he had built companies, saved businesses, protected investors. But this moment felt different. This wasn't money. This was Sarah. And maybe something more. Daniel stood up. Get the car ready, he told his staff. We're going to the hospital. Ethan's shoulders dropped with relief. But as Daniel folded the letter and placed it in his pocket, his eyes returned to one final line he hadn't fully understood yet. If anything happens to me, you deserve to know the truth about Ethan. Because he isn't just my son. Daniel looked at the boy walking beside him toward the door. And for the first time, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. What if this child hadn't come for help? What if he had come home? The car moved quietly through the wet streets, its headlights cutting through the rain like narrow beams of memory. Ethan sat in the back seat, his small hands folded tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the window. He didn't look around. He didn't ask questions. He carried himself with the quiet discipline of a child who had learned too early not to expect comfort. Daniel watched him through the rearview mirror. There was something in the boy's silence that hurt more than tears would have. Have you eaten today? Daniel asked after a moment. Ethan shook his head. Not since yesterday. Daniel's chest tightened. Why didn't you say something? Ethan hesitated, then spoke softly. Mom says you don't ask for things unless it's really important. Daniel looked away, staring out at the rain as guilt settled heavily in his chest. A child shouldn't live by rules like that. They stopped briefly at a drive-through. Ethan held the paper bag carefully, like it was something valuable, and thanked the driver before taking small, careful bites. He didn't rush. He didn't waste a crumb. Daniel had signed deals worth millions without thinking twice. And now he found himself watching a 10-year-old eat a sandwich like it was a blessing. The hospital came into view 20 minutes later. It was an older building, one of the city's public facilities. The lights flickered slightly in the entrance, and the waiting area looked tired, worn down by too many long nights and too many people who couldn't afford better care. Ethan's breathing grew faster as they walked inside. She's on the 3rd floor, he said quietly. Room 312. Daniel followed him down the hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last. He hadn't seen Sarah in 25 years. He didn't know what he would find. He didn't know what he would feel. But when they reached the door, Ethan stopped. You should go first, the boy whispered. Daniel pushed the door open slowly. The woman lying in the hospital bed looked smaller than he remembered. Time and hardship had carved gentle lines into her face. Her hair, once bright and full of life, was thinner now, touched with gray. But even after all these years, he knew her immediately. Sarah, he breathed. Her eyes opened slowly. For a moment, Confusion flickered across her face. Then she saw him, and everything in her expression changed. Not surprise. Not shock. Relief. Tears filled her eyes as a weak smile formed. "You came," she whispered. Daniel moved closer to the bed, his voice unsteady. "Ethan came to find me." Her gaze shifted toward the door, where the boy stood watching quietly. "I told him you would," she said. Daniel pulled a chair closer and sat beside her. "What happened, Sarah?" he asked softly. "Why didn't you ever come to me?" Sarah closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. "Because I thought I had already ruined your life once," she said. "I didn't want to destroy it again." Daniel shook his head. "You never ruined anything. You disappeared. You left without a word." Her breathing grew shallow. "I left because I found out I was pregnant," she said. The words hung in the air. Daniel's heart stopped. "I came to tell you," she continued, her voice trembling. "But the day I went to your office, your father met me instead." Daniel's hands tightened around the edge of the chair. "What did he say?" Sarah's eyes filled with pain. "He told me you were engaged to someone from a wealthy family. Said the wedding had already been arranged. He told me if I really loved you, I wouldn't come between you and your future." Daniel stared at her, stunned. "That's not true," he said quietly. "I was never engaged. I never agreed to anything like that." Sarah gave a sad smile. "I didn't know that back then. I was young. Scared. And when he offered me money to leave, I thought maybe he was right. Maybe you deserved a better life than the one I could give you." Daniel felt a cold anger settle deep inside him. All those years. All that time. Gone because of a lie. "I never took the money," Sarah added quickly. "I just left. I moved to a small town. I worked 2 jobs. I tried to give Ethan a good life." She looked toward the doorway again. "He's all I ever had." Daniel swallowed hard. "And you never told him about me?" Sarah shook her head. "I didn't want him growing up thinking he had a rich father who chose not to be there." The words hit Daniel like a blow. "I would have come," he said quietly. "If I had known, I would have come the first day." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I gave him your name. I always believed, if things ever got too hard, you would do the right thing." Her strength was fading now. Each breath looked like effort. The doctor entered briefly, speaking with Daniel about her condition. Severe infection. Complications from years without proper medical care. Treatment was possible, but it would be long and expensive. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Do whatever she needs," he said. "Move her to the best private unit. I'll cover everything." When the doctor left, Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You don't owe me anything." Daniel shook his head. "I owe you 25 years, he said quietly. Ethan stepped into the room then, moving carefully toward the bed. "Mom." Sarah reached for his hand. "I'm here, sweetheart." The boy looked between them, sensing the weight in the air. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. Sarah smiled gently. "I think things are going to change now." Daniel stood beside them, watching mother and son together. For the first time, the truth was no longer just a suspicion. It was beginning to take shape. But there was still one thing no one had said out loud. And as Sarah squeezed Ethan's hand, she looked up at Daniel and whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something you still don't know about him." Daniel leaned closer to the bed, his heart beating slowly but heavily, like every second carried weight. "What is it?" he asked gently. Sarah's fingers tightened around Ethan's hand. Her eyes moved between the two of them, filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "You should sit," she whispered to Daniel. He didn't argue. He pulled the chair closer again, lowering himself slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Ethan stood quietly beside the bed, his small shoulders tense, like he already understood this moment mattered. Sarah took a careful breath. "Ethan, sweetheart," she said softly, "can you give us a minute?" The boy hesitated. His eyes flickered toward Daniel, uncertain. Daniel spoke gently. "There's a waiting area right outside the door. I'll come get you in a few minutes. I promise." Ethan studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." He walked out quietly, closing the door behind him. For a few seconds, the room was silent except for the steady sound of the monitor beside the bed. Sarah looked back at Daniel. "I didn't lie to you in the letter," she said. "He is your son." Daniel closed his eyes. Even though he had felt it, even though something inside him had already known, hearing the words out loud hit him like a wave. "My son," he repeated softly. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "But that's not the whole truth." Daniel's eyes opened again. "What do you mean?" Her voice shook slightly. "When Ethan was born, he was very sick. The doctors said his heart wasn't fully developed. They told me he might not survive his first year." Daniel's chest tightened. "I didn't have insurance. I didn't have savings. I was working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads." Her breathing grew heavier as she spoke. "I went to a specialist once. Just one visit. The tests alone cost more than 3 months of my rent." Daniel leaned forward. "Why didn't you contact me then?" Sarah gave a tired smile. "Because your father found me again." Daniel's hands slowly curled into fists. "He told me if I came to you, if I told you about the baby, he would make sure your company never approved funding for the medical foundation I was trying to get help from. He said powerful people protect their own." Daniel's jaw tightened. "He threatened a sick child?" he said quietly. Sarah nodded faintly. "I believed him. And I was afraid that if your life got dragged into my struggle, you'd lose everything you worked for." She looked down for a moment. "So I made a choice. I stopped looking for help from anyone connected to your world." Daniel felt something break inside him. All those years, she had been fighting alone. "What happened with his heart?" he asked softly. Sarah's eyes filled with quiet emotion. "A local doctor agreed to treat him for almost nothing. Said sometimes kids surprise you. And Ethan did. He grew stronger. Every year, his checkups got better." A small smile touched her lips. "He's tougher than he looks." Daniel thought about the boy walking miles in the rain without complaining. Yes, he believed that. "But there's still a problem," Sarah continued. Daniel's attention sharpened. "The condition didn't disappear. It improved, but the doctor always said, when he gets older, he'll need surgery. A major one." The room felt colder. "When?" Daniel asked. "Soon," she whispered. "Maybe within a year. Maybe less." Daniel stood up slowly, running a hand through his hair. "How much?" "I don't know exactly. But more than I could ever afford." She looked at him, her voice breaking. "That's why I finally wrote the letter. Not for me. For him." Daniel walked to the window and stood there for a moment, staring at the dark city outside. He had built hospitals, funded research, donated millions to medical programs, and his own son had grown up wondering if he would live long enough to become a man. He turned back toward the bed. "Why didn't you tell him?" Daniel asked. "About his condition?" Sarah shook her head weakly. "He knows he gets tired faster sometimes. He knows he has to see doctors. But he doesn't know how serious it might be." Her eyes filled with fear. I didn't want him growing up afraid of his own future. Daniel sat back down beside her. He won't be afraid anymore, he said quietly. Not while I'm here. Sarah studied his face. You mean that? Daniel nodded. I lost 25 years. I'm not losing another day. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I was so scared you'd be angry. I am angry, Daniel said honestly. But not at you. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Sarah reached for his hand. There's one more thing. Daniel felt his heart tighten again. What is it? Her voice dropped to a fragile whisper. Ethan doesn't trust rich people. Daniel blinked. Why? Because every time someone with money came into our lives, they left. Landlords who raised rent without warning. Employers who cut my hours when I got sick. Programs that promised help but never called back. Her eyes searched his. I told him you were different. But he's scared. He thinks if he gets close to you, you might decide he doesn't belong in your world. Daniel sat very still. For the first time, the real weight of what lay ahead settled on him. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about medical care. This was about earning the trust of a boy who had learned not to believe in people like him. A quiet knock came at the door. Ethan's small voice followed. Mom? Can I come back in? Sarah squeezed Daniel's hand once before letting go. Please, she whispered. Don't just save his life. Daniel stood as the door opened. Stay, she said softly. Ethan walked back to the bed, looking between them. Daniel took a slow breath, then stepped closer to the boy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, Ethan, how would you feel about staying with me for a while? The boy didn't answer right away. He just looked at him, long, carefully. And then he asked the question that made Daniel's heart sink. You mean, like charity? Daniel didn't answer right away. The word charity hung in the air like a wall between them. Ethan wasn't being rude. He wasn't being ungrateful. His voice was calm, careful. The voice of a child who had learned the difference between help and pity. Daniel lowered himself slightly so he was at eye level with him. No, he said gently. Not charity. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on his face, searching for something real. Then what? The boy asked. Daniel took a slow breath. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without hesitation. But this moment, this was the hardest conversation of his life. I was thinking, he said quietly, more like family. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened. Family? He repeated. Sarah watched from the bed, her eyes filled with silent hope and fear. Daniel nodded. I didn't know about you before today. That's my fault, even if I didn't understand why. But now that I do, I don't want to be someone who just writes a check and disappears. Ethan's voice came out small but steady. People say things like that sometimes. Daniel felt the truth in those words. Then don't believe what I say, he replied softly. Watch what I do. The boy looked down at his shoes. My mom and I, we've never lived in a big place, he said. We don't have fancy stuff. I don't know how to act around rich people. Daniel's chest tightened. You don't have to act any way, he said. You just have to be you. Ethan glanced up briefly. What if I mess something up? Daniel gave a small, tired smile. Then we'll mess it up together. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he looked toward the hospital bed. Mom? Sarah's voice was weak but warm. I trust him, sweetheart. The boy studied her face carefully, as if weighing her words. Then he turned back to Daniel. Just for a while, he said quietly. Until she gets better. Daniel nodded immediately. For as long as you need. Ethan didn't smile, but his shoulders relaxed just a little. That small shift felt like progress. Later that evening, arrangements were already moving quickly. Sarah was being transferred to a private medical unit where specialists would monitor her condition closely. The difference between the crowded public floor and the quiet private wing was impossible to ignore. Soft lighting. Clean rooms. Nurses who came within seconds instead of minutes. Ethan noticed it too. As they walked beside the moving hospital bed, he stayed close to Daniel, but he didn't speak. When they reached the new room, Sarah was settled in carefully. She looked more comfortable already, though exhaustion still covered her face. Ethan climbed onto the chair beside her, holding her hand. "See?" she whispered to him. "Things are changing." Ethan nodded, but his eyes moved toward Daniel again. Not fully trusting. Not fully afraid. Just watching. Daniel stood near the window, giving them space. But inside, something was shifting in him. 4 years, his life had been organized, controlled, predictable. Now everything felt uncertain. And strangely, meaningful. A nurse entered briefly, speaking softly with Daniel about Sarah's treatment plan. Tests. Medication. Possible surgery if her condition didn't improve. He approved everything without hesitation. When the nurse left, Ethan spoke quietly. "Is all this really okay?" Daniel turned toward him. "Yes. But it must cost a lot." "It does." Ethan looked down. "You don't have to spend that much." Daniel walked over and sat across from him. "Ethan, listen to me." The boy looked up. "Money is only valuable if it helps the people who matter. And right now, you and your mom matter." Ethan studied his face again. "Why?" he asked. The question was simple. But the answer wasn't. Daniel's voice came out softer than he expected. "Because I should have been there a long time ago." Ethan didn't respond. But this time, he didn't look away either. That night, after Sarah fell asleep, Ethan sat quietly in the chair beside her. "You should get some rest," Daniel said. "I don't like leaving her alone." "You won't be far," Daniel replied. "There's a family room down the hall. I'll stay here with her." Ethan hesitated. "You promise you won't leave?" Daniel met his eyes. "I promise." After a long pause, the boy stood. But before he walked out, he turned back. "My mom says promises are important." "They are," Daniel said. Ethan nodded once, then left the room. When the door closed, the quiet returned. Daniel sat beside Sarah's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. 25 years. He thought about all the birthdays he missed. First days of school. Doctor visits. Hard nights. Small victories. All the moments another man should have been there for. Except there had been no other man. Just her. And a boy who had grown up too strong for his age. Daniel leaned back in the chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. But just as he closed his eyes for a moment, Sarah stirred. "Daniel," she whispered. "I'm here." Her eyes opened slightly. "There's something I need to tell you about your father." Daniel's expression hardened. "What about him?" Sarah's voice trembled. "He didn't just lie to separate us." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Her eyes filled with quiet fear. "He came to see me again, years later." Daniel leaned forward slowly. "And what did he want?" Sarah swallowed, her voice barely audible. "He wanted me to promise that Ethan would never know your name." Daniel stared at her, the words settling slowly, like something heavy sinking deep into his chest. "Never know my name?" he repeated quietly. Sarah nodded weakly. He said if you ever found out about Ethan, it would ruin your life. That your company, your reputation, everything you built would be affected. He told me powerful families don't survive scandals. Daniel felt a cold anger rise inside him, steady and controlled, the kind that didn't explode, but didn't disappear either. What scandal? He asked. A man having a child with the woman he loved? Sarah's eyes filled with tired sadness. It wasn't about the truth, she said softly. It was about control. Daniel stood up and walked a few steps away, running a hand over his face. Memories of his father came back in sharp flashes. A man who believed emotions were weaknesses. A man who treated life like a strategy board. How long ago was this? Daniel asked. About 9 years ago, Sarah replied. Daniel turned back sharply. 9 years? That means he knew Ethan existed. Sarah nodded. He came to the apartment. He didn't stay long. Just long enough to make sure I understood his condition. Daniel's voice grew tight. What condition? That if I ever contacted you, or if Ethan ever showed up in your life, he would make sure every door I depended on would close. Work, housing, medical aid, everything. The room fell silent. Sarah's voice trembled. I believed him. Because a few months later, the clinic that was helping Ethan suddenly stopped returning my calls. My landlord raised the rent without warning. The job I had for 3 years cut my hours in half. Daniel didn't speak. But something inside him was breaking apart, piece by piece. So you stayed quiet, he said finally. I stayed invisible, Sarah whispered. Daniel walked back to the chair and sat down slowly. He died 5 years ago, Daniel said after a moment. And even then, he never told me any of this. Sarah gave a faint, sad smile. He probably thought he was protecting your future. Daniel's eyes hardened. He wasn't protecting my future, he said quietly. He was stealing my family. The words hung in the air. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah reached for his hand again. I didn't tell you this to make you angry, she said. I told you because I need you to understand something. Daniel looked at her. What? Her eyes were filled with quiet fear. If Ethan ever finds out someone tried to keep him away from you, he might think he was a mistake, or a problem, or something people were ashamed of. Daniel shook his head immediately. He will never think that. You have to show him, she said gently. Not with money, not with comfort, with time, with patience. Daniel nodded slowly. I will. Sarah studied his face for a moment, as if trying to believe what she saw there. I know you want to fix everything fast, she continued. But Ethan doesn't trust quick changes. His whole life has been about surviving, not expecting. Daniel thought about the boy asking if staying with him meant charity. Yes, he said quietly. I understand that now. A soft knock came at the door before it opened slightly. Ethan stepped back inside. I didn't want to fall asleep, he said. What if she needed something? Sarah smiled faintly. Come here, sweetheart. He walked over and sat beside her again. Daniel watched them for a moment, then spoke carefully. Ethan, tomorrow I'd like you to come home with me. The boy's eyes moved toward him. Your house. Yes. Ethan hesitated. Just for a while, he asked. For as long as your mom is here getting better. Ethan looked at Sarah. She nodded. It'll be easier for him to take care of things that way. The boy looked back at Daniel, uncertainty still in his eyes. I don't have a lot of stuff, he said. That's okay. I only have one backpack. That's enough. Ethan shifted slightly. Your house is probably really big. Daniel gave a small smile. It is. The boy looked down. I don't want to get lost. Daniel's voice softened. Then we'll learn it together. Ethan didn't answer right away. But this time, he didn't resist either. A few minutes later, Sarah fell asleep again. The room grew quiet. Ethan sat beside the bed, watching her carefully. Daniel moved closer and spoke softly. You did something very brave today. Ethan glanced at him. I just followed what she told me. You walked across the city in the rain to find someone you didn't even know, Daniel said. That takes courage. Ethan looked down at his hands. I wasn't brave, he said quietly. I was scared the whole time. Daniel nodded. Being scared and doing it anyway, that's what courage is. The boy thought about that. After a moment, he asked something carefully. Why didn't you come before? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Because there was no simple explanation for 25 lost years. I didn't know you existed, he said honestly. Ethan studied his face. You would have come? Yes. Even if we were poor? Daniel didn't hesitate. Especially then. Ethan looked back at his mother, still sleeping. Then he asked one more question, his voice small but serious. If I stay with you, do I have to call you sir? Daniel felt his throat tighten. No, he said quietly. You don't. Ethan hesitated. Then, what should I call you? Daniel looked at him, the weight of the moment settling in. But before he could answer, the heart monitor beside Sarah suddenly changed its rhythm. And the steady sound in the quiet room became fast, uneven, and sharp. The sharp beeping cut through the quiet like a warning no one wanted to hear. Ethan froze. Mom? He whispered. Sarah's breathing had changed. It was shallow now, uneven, her chest rising too fast, then pausing too long. Daniel was already moving. He pressed the call button beside the bed. We need a nurse in here now. The monitor kept flashing, the rhythm unstable. Ethan grabbed his mother's hand. Mom, I'm here. I'm right here. Sarah's eyes opened slightly, but they looked distant, unfocused. Within seconds, medical staff rushed into the room. Calm voices, quick movements, hands adjusting equipment, checking vitals. Daniel stepped back, but Ethan didn't move. Sir, one of the nurses said gently, he needs to step outside. Ethan shook his head immediately. No, I'm staying. Daniel knelt beside him. Ethan, he said softly, keeping his voice steady, they need space to help her. The boy's eyes were wide, full of fear. What if she wakes up and I'm not here? Daniel swallowed. I'll stay with you. Right outside the door. She'll know you're here. For a moment, Ethan resisted. Then Sarah's breathing hitched again, and the urgency in the room became impossible to ignore. Slowly, reluctantly, Ethan let Daniel guide him toward the hallway. The door closed behind them. The sound of medical voices was muffled now, but the tension remained heavy in the air. Ethan stood there, staring at the door. She's going to be okay, Daniel said quietly. Ethan didn't answer. After a long moment, he spoke. She almost died once before. Daniel looked at him. When I was little, Ethan continued, she got really sick. She still went to work because we needed the money. One day she fainted at the bus stop. His voice stayed calm, but his fingers were gripping the sleeve of his backpack tightly. I thought she wasn't going to wake up. I sat next to her until the ambulance came. Daniel felt his chest tighten. You've been taking care of each other for a long time, he said. Ethan nodded. She always says it's just us against the world. The words lingered between them. Daniel leaned back against the wall beside him. It doesn't have to be just the two of you anymore, he said carefully. Ethan didn't respond right away. He kept his eyes on the door. "You really mean that?" he asked quietly. "Yes." Ethan hesitated. "People say they'll help," he said. "But sometimes they just help for a little while. Then they get busy. Or they forget." Daniel understood what the boy wasn't saying. Temporary help had probably been the story of their lives. "I'm not going anywhere," Daniel said. Ethan finally looked at him. "Even when she gets better?" "Yes." "Even if I'm not like the kids you know?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't need you to be like anyone else." Ethan studied him for a long moment. Then he asked something that sounded simple, but carried years of experience behind it. "Are you sure you won't get tired of us?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he spoke slowly, honestly. "I'm tired of not having you." The boy's expression shifted slightly. Not trust yet, but something softer. Before either of them could say more, the door opened. A doctor stepped out. Daniel stood immediately. "How is she?" The doctor spoke calmly, but his expression was serious. "She had a cardiac episode triggered by the infection and overall weakness. We've stabilized her for now." Ethan stepped closer. "Can we see her?" "In a moment," the doctor said gently. "But I want to be honest with you." Daniel felt the weight in his tone. "Her condition is more fragile than we initially thought. She's been under severe physical strain for years. Malnutrition, stress, lack of consistent medical care. Her body has been surviving on very little." Daniel nodded slowly. "What does she need?" "Intensive treatment, close monitoring, and time. But there's something else." The doctor paused. "If her recovery becomes complicated, she may need a high-risk procedure to support her heart." Ethan's face went pale. "Will she die?" he asked. The doctor knelt slightly so they were eye level. "We're doing everything to prevent that." It wasn't a promise, but it was the truth. A few minutes later, they were allowed back into the room. Sarah was conscious again, though weak. Tubes and monitors surrounded her now, the quiet reality of how serious things had become. Ethan moved straight to her side. "I'm here," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "I know." Daniel stood at the other side of the bed. For the first time, the three of them were there together. Not strangers. Not separate lives. One quiet, fragile circle. Sarah looked at Daniel. "You should take him home tonight," she whispered. "He needs rest." Ethan immediately shook his head. "I'm not leaving you." Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "You're not leaving me. You're going somewhere safe." The boy looked between them. Daniel spoke carefully. "I'll bring you back first thing in the morning." Ethan hesitated. Then he leaned closer to his mother. "I'll come early," he promised. Sarah nodded. As they walked out of the hospital later that night, the rain had stopped. The city was quiet, the streets reflecting soft lights. Ethan climbed into the back seat again, holding his backpack tightly. For most of the drive, neither of them spoke. Then, halfway there, Ethan asked quietly, "Is your house really big?" "Yes." "Do you live there alone?" Daniel paused. "Yes." Ethan looked out the window for a moment. "That must feel empty." Daniel glanced at him through the mirror. "It does." The boy nodded slowly. Then he asked one more question. "When we get there, where am I supposed to sleep?" Daniel answered gently. "You'll have your own room." Ethan was quiet again. But after a few seconds, he spoke in a voice that was careful, almost worried. "Is it okay if I keep my backpack with me?" Daniel's voice softened. "You can keep anything you need." Ethan nodded. The car turned through the long gates of the estate. The house rose ahead of them, large and quiet under the night sky. Ethan stared at it, his expression unreadable. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "This place doesn't look like somewhere someone like me is supposed to live." Daniel didn't answer right away. He parked the car slowly, the engine going quiet as the large house stood still around them, its tall windows glowing softly in the night. Then he turned in his seat and looked at Ethan. "Then maybe," he said gently, "it's time this place became somewhere you do belong." Ethan didn't move. His eyes went from the house to Daniel and back again. They walked inside together. The front doors opened into the wide entry hall, the marble floor shining under warm lights. The space was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that comes from years of being lived in but not shared. Ethan stepped in carefully, like he was afraid to touch anything. "Wow," he whispered. Daniel watched him, and for the first time, he didn't see the house the way he always had. He saw it the way Ethan saw it. Big, cold, empty. "Come on," Daniel said softly. "Let me show you your room." They walked down the hallway, past rooms that had been closed for years. When Daniel opened the door, Ethan stopped. The room wasn't fancy. Not overly decorated. Just warm. A bed. A desk. A lamp. A window looking out over the trees. Simple. Quiet. Safe. Ethan stepped inside slowly. "This is for me?" "Yes." The boy ran his fingers over the blanket, then set his backpack carefully on the bed. After a moment, he asked quietly, "Can I leave my stuff out?" Daniel smiled a little. "You don't have to pack it away here. This isn't temporary." Ethan looked at him, unsure. Daniel stepped closer. "You asked me earlier what to call me." Ethan nodded. Daniel took a breath. "You can call me Daniel if you want. Or, if it ever feels right, you can call me Dad." The word stayed in the air. Ethan's eyes widened slightly. He didn't answer. He just nodded once, quietly, like he was holding that word somewhere safe inside, not ready to use it yet. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep with his backpack still beside him, Daniel stood in the hallway outside the room. 4 years, this house had been a monument to success. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like a home waiting to begin. The weeks that followed were not easy. Sarah's recovery moved slowly. Some days she improved. Other days were harder. But she was never alone again. Daniel was there every morning, every evening, sitting beside her, listening, learning the life she and Ethan had built through struggle and quiet strength. Ethan began adjusting too. The first days, he barely spoke. He kept his things organized in one corner of the room, like he might have to leave at any moment. But Daniel showed up. Every day. Breakfast together. A ride to school. Homework at the kitchen table. Simple routines. No pressure. No promises he couldn't keep. Trust didn't come all at once. It came slowly. One afternoon, about a month later, Ethan walked into Daniel's office holding a school paper. "I got an A," he said, trying to sound casual. Daniel looked up. "That's great." Ethan hesitated. Then he asked quietly, "Do you want to put it on the fridge?" Daniel's throat tightened. "Yeah," he said softly. "I really do." Sarah was discharged 2 months later. When she walked into the house for the first time, she stopped just inside the doorway, overwhelmed. "I never imagined this," she whispered. Daniel shook his head gently. "This isn't about the house. It's about not being alone anymore." Ethan ran to her then, wrapping his arms around her carefully. "We're staying," he told her. Sarah looked at Daniel, her eyes full of quiet emotion. And that night, as the three of them sat at the dinner table together, something shifted. Not wealth. Not comfort. Family. Months passed. Ethan's medical evaluations were completed. The surgery he needed was scheduled. The best specialists. The best care. No delays. No waiting lists. On the morning of the procedure, Ethan sat in the hospital bed, nervous but trying not to show it. Daniel sat beside him. "Are you scared?" he asked. Ethan nodded a little. "Yeah." Daniel reached for his hand. "So am I." Ethan looked at him. "You are." Daniel smiled softly. "That's what happens when someone matters this much to you." Ethan squeezed his hand. Then, after a long pause, he said it for the first time. "Dad, will you be here when I wake up?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "I'll be right here." The surgery took hours. The waiting felt longer than the past 25 years. But when the doctor finally came out with a small smile and said, "It went well," something inside Daniel finally let go. When Ethan woke up, the first thing he saw was Daniel sitting beside him. Just like he promised. Years later, the house was no longer quiet. There was laughter. Arguments over homework. Weekend breakfasts that lasted too long. Photo frames filling the empty walls. Sarah's health stabilized. She returned to work part-time, not because she had to, but because she wanted her independence back. And Daniel changed too. He worked less. He lived more. One evening, as the three of them sat together on the back porch, watching the sunset, Ethan leaned against him. "Do you ever wish things happened differently?" the boy asked. Daniel thought about it. The lost years. The lies. The distance. The pain. Then he looked at Sarah. At Ethan. At the life that almost never happened. "No," he said quietly. "Why not?" Daniel wrapped an arm around his son. "Because love didn't come into my life when I was successful. It came when I finally learned what success really means." Sometimes life separates people. Sometimes pride, fear, or power builds walls that take years to break. But when love finds its way back, it doesn't care about money, status, or the past. Because in the end, the richest life is the one where no one you love has to face the world alone. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing, and tell us in the comments which region you're watching from.